Welcome to Living Fullness, a podcast where two unusual friends explore all things friendships, relationships, and the Christian life. My name is Stina Constantine.
And I'm Father Sean Burns. And each month we bring you a guest, someone who will share their experience and strengths with us, helping us to learn, grow, and live life to the full.
Hello and welcome back to Living Fullness. Whether you're listening in through your earpiece, in your car or in your home, as always, you are most welcome. We have with us another guest today. Padre, would you like to introduce our guest to us?
Absolutely. So we have with us today Conor Sweeney. Conor is presently living in Virginia, and Conor and I go a little way back. You taught me, Conor. I mean, not that you necessarily wanted to. You know, I'm not like the greatest student. You may not want to own up to that. So,
what are you talking about?
Conor was one of my teachers at the John Paul II Institute, and he was an academic here in Australia for how long were you here in Australia for, Conor?
It was about 7-8 years.
Yeah, okay.
While I was teaching.
Okay,
of course,
sure,
I was studying here a couple of years before that. But
yeah. And now he's in Virginia teaching at Christendom College, which, as I understand, is a liberal arts college. Yeah.
It is. Yes.
Yeah. Conor is going to talk to us today about evangelization. And about some of the necessary kind of preconditions for that to take place, what might obstruct that, and how we might actually sort of successfully engage in it in what are fairly difficult times. So, Conor, tell us about your story. What are sort of the most important things that our listeners would need to know about you?
Well, it's not a particularly glamorous story, probably, but certainly if I was a kid and you were to tell me that some, decades in the future, I would be teaching theology, that I would have taught theology in Australia, and then that I would have moved to America, to another institution, I wouldn't have believed you as a young kid. Probably my early life was more interested in sports than anything to do with the brain, the mind. So I came to the game, as it were. I was a bit of a late bloomer, but basically when I finished high school, the one thing that I did know was that I didn't want to go straight to work. So I decided, well, I'll go to university. That's at least 4 years to put off the inevitable. So I did general studies, and about halfway through that, I sort of had a bit of a mini reconversion to the faith, and I became interested in John Paul II's theology of the body. And then that sort of started me down the theological path, properly speaking. And I ended up finishing my undergrad degree with just a general studies and then a Bachelor of Arts. And then from that, I sort of figured out, well, let's give it a go. I'm interested in the theology of the body. I'm interested in it at this point, primarily pastorally. But I decided, well, I know there's this place called the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family, and I want to study there, and I don't know where that's going to lead me, but what the heck, we'll give it a go. So at that time, I'd sort of been dating with my future wife, and we were engaged, we got married, and as it turned out, it made more sense to go to Australia, to the John Paul II Institute there, than to Washington, D.C., which made more sense just because it was closer. But we ended up having an extended 2-year honeymoon in Australia, so we took the Australian option. I mean, it's ironic now because now I'm teaching an hour away from Washington, D.C. It's a strange world. But anyway, so I went and got my master's at the John Paul II Institute, and that became, I was asked to do a doctorate and then come back and teach at the Institute. And it was very much a week before we were scheduled to come home. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I was going to have this master's degree, but I didn't really know at the time what I was called to. I didn't know how I could actually use that for the good of the church. But as it turned out, the dean of the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family, Tracy Rowland, the week before we left for Canada, asked me if I wanted to do a doctorate in Rome. And so, okay, well, I mean, that's a door open, I would think. So I said, yeah, I'll think about that. And within a month, we decided, yeah, we'll give it a shot. So I ended up spending 2 years in Rome, did the pontifical doctorate, and then back to Canada for a year, had a couple kids in between, and ended up back in Australia in 2012. And I taught at the Institute from 2012 to 2018, 19-ish. So then, of course, the tragic story of the Institute shut down by the Archbishop. We don't have to go into details on that. But as Providence had it, I ended up getting a job here at Christendom College, and that's where I am currently.
Yeah. Fantastic.
So you were here then for quite some time. By here, I mean in Australia for quite some time.
Yes, that's correct.
Tell us a little bit about
really
what that experience was like for you, and what
it was good. It was very good. Being Canadian, we sort of took to the Australian sense of humor and sort of laid back attitude. So we felt very, very comfortable there right from the start, made some great friends, wonderful colleagues. I still keep in touch with colleagues regularly. The climate's good, even in Melbourne, the climate is good. I mean, Melbourne compared to Vancouver, if you don't like the rain, don't live in Vancouver. So okay. I love the winter where you could actually do gardening and stuff. But no, it was a good experience all around. And realistically, I mean, if things had worked out differently and I could have stayed employed there, it would have been somewhere where we could easily have seen ourselves living for the rest of our life.
Yeah. So you told us that you teach in Christendom College. What is it that you teach?
I'm in the theology department, and basically what I'm currently teaching is what we call the core. So every student at the college in their 4-year degree, starting their freshman and then through their junior year, freshman, sophomore, juniors, they got to take core subjects. So I'm currently teaching the core, but there will be scope for developing some electives beyond that. So I think I'm actually planning on doing an elective this fall on the death of God, atheism, which is a topic which is dear to my heart in some way, if you can call atheism dear to one's heart. But currently teaching undergrads freshman theology, intro to theology courses, and then I'm doing some evangelization and apologetics in one particular course that'll be relevant to our conversation today, so hopefully it's still fresh in my mind. And I've also taught moral theology as well, so fairly few different things I've turned my hands to here.
So we've already said to you that we were keen to talk about evangelization today, and since you've raised it there, you quite literally wrote a book on it, and
I did.
It was Abiding the Long Defeat, and I can remember picking that book up when I was a student, writing an essay for you, and thinking I need every possible mark that I can get. So maybe if I reference the lecturer's work, I might get an extra.
That can be a risky strategy.
So I remember getting the book, and I looked at the front cover, and I thought, yeah, that's a bit strange. I have no idea why that's there. And then I moved on, right? And it's only that I picked up the book again recently to have another read. And as I'm looking at it, I thought, that cover's rather profound.
It works. Yeah. It wasn't my doing. It was my publisher. And I was actually quite amazed to see them have internalized the book in the way they did.
Yeah.
So for our listeners and our viewers who haven't seen it before, can you give us a bit of a description of what the front cover looks like?
If I show it, is it going
One better. Yeah.
Yep. So this is the front cover. And I think I've just improved this frame by holding it in front of my face.
But for our listeners who can't see the cover.
So for the listeners who can't see the cover, there's a couple who are taking a selfie on the shore of a beach, and in the beach itself is baptism taking place, and it's sort of in the ocean itself. There's baptism taking place, and there's no there's not even a recognition of what's going on from those who are taking a selfie, and so it's sort of to me it stands as a bit of a contrast, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, because that so summarizes your book. It's
It does. I mean, it's funny because I assumed that, there's also this theme of Tolkien and hobbits. So the subtitle is How to Evangelize Like a Hobbit in a Disenchanted Age. So my assumption was, the publisher is going to go with, the kind of maybe a romantic sort of pastoral whatever, and show something related to hobbits and, countryside and trees and something sort of nice and sentimental like that. But they actually keyed in on, some of the more intense themes in the books, perhaps, and that's represented by this image here. So, I mean, if there is hobbits in it, and I'll talk about hobbits in a second, there's also baptism, and so this notion of faith as total immersion. So faith is not just a cognitive act. I mean, it is this bodily act, and it's a nice image here because it is full immersion here
yeah.
in this particular representation of baptism. So by baptism, you are immersed fully in the incarnation, the passion, the death, the resurrection of Christ. And this is symbolically, in a sacramentally real way, embodied in the baptismal rite itself. And so you go down into the dark waters of death with Christ, and your old nature is put to death, and you rise again. You burst out of the font gasping for air, and you become a new creation. And now you are related to God in a way that you weren't before. And so there's this radical identity when we talk about what it means to be a believer. So that's kind of in the background in this image here on my front cover. And in the foreground, we have this couple in bathing suits, and that actually scandalized one of my more traditionalist friends. But what can you do? And of course, they're holding the proverbial selfie stick, which is a remarkably narcissistic application of digital technology. And that says something too. So it's like we've forgotten baptism. We've closed things in on ourselves. And if we have faith, well, maybe this couple, maybe they're believers, maybe they go to church on Sunday. Well, we can pass judgment on them as individuals, and they don't even exist because there's not even a photograph. Anyway, there is this sense that as a culture, we've turned away from faith. We've turned away particularly from this embodied idea of faith. Faith, if we have it, is maybe a kind of abstraction. Maybe we pray to God in those dire moments when we need him, but most of the time we're happy when he doesn't make too of an intrusive appearance in our life. So as a culture, the foreground picture of the selfie stick and the couple, that's a image of the cultural dimension of the book. The fact that God is, as Nietzsche put it, dead. He has become culturally, socially, existentially irrelevant to us as a culture. Now, in the book, I basically say, well, baptism is our only real way forward at this time. If you want to talk about evangelization, if you want to talk about reconnecting with the vital truth of Christian faith, it has to go by way of the font. And in the font is not just new life, but it's also what I like to call a fundamental anthropology. It's telling you who you are as a person in relation to God, in relation to others. The imagery of this filial adoption, becoming a child, becoming a son in the Son, sharing in Christ's relation to the Father as Son, being related to other people, other baptized in the church, communion, the image of nuptial one flesh here, Christ and the church. All of this is in some sense embodied in the text. And so if we do in fact want to detach ourselves from the secular liturgies of the age, an age that shapes our desires not in the direction of God, but in the direction of some substitute, ultimately I would say we need the jolt of baptism, not just as a ritual, not just as a little dump of water in the head, but again, as a kind of full immersion into an alternative way of living.
beautiful. That as a priest, that really does sit with me because the a lot of times when I baptize a baby, it's often a case that I suspect that often it's seen as a rite of passage.
Correct.
I suspect that it's seen as a moment of well, we get this one baptized because that's what mum and dad did for me, and look, I mean, it's the gate of salvation. It's the fundamental. I'm never going to say no. I'm never going to reject or anything like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
Uh,
Right.
but
Right.
but it just strikes me that we don't approach baptism with the uh, with the reverence that it deserves as the
Mm,
sacrament by which we really are called out of ourselves, as you say, as sons in the Son.
that's right. And of course, there are many reasons for that, but there is also a kind of, as Ratzinger puts it, this inability to understand a sacrament and what a sacrament means, how water can have these healing properties, actually giving birth to a spiritual reality. So these things are very difficult for modern, secular, postmodern man to understand. And part of the other part of that book in regards to culture is very much trying to dial into the fact, well, why is it that we can't understand something like
Yeah.
baptism?
Mm.
Why is it that we understand God to be dead? What has happened in terms of our historical understanding?
Yeah.
Because the
Yeah.
world used to be God was the one thing that was sort of always present as a presupposition. Sure, we might have different ideas about him, but now the norm sort of is, well, God is dead, or at best an afterthought.
Mm.
And so there are significant challenges in terms of getting people to again understand that it's not just a little drip of water on the head and it makes everyone feel good and we get to dress the baby up and we get to have
Mm.
refreshments afterwards. That's obviously part of it. You could say that's the communal, familial reality of coming together as a community, and that's great. But of course, underneath that is the engine of that communion in terms of what we do as a people and how we understand ourselves fundamentally. So my basic point is the resources are there, but they have to be applied, they have to be deepened, they have to be articulated perhaps in new ways.
Sure. Sure. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that, because that as I say, that picture, I've had this book for years, and it's only as I've recently pulled it out and had a good thorough look at the front cover that I've realised I've been missing something quite essential on that front cover.
Well, you almost don't have to read the book then.
That's right. Just look at the front cover and divine the meaning.
I shouldn't say that. Yeah.
So the second part of the first thing that you mentioned is about your book, Evangelize Like a Hobbit. What
Mhm.
you've got to unpack for someone who's not read the book yet. Can you
Sure.
unpack that?
Okay. Well, along with the theme of baptism, along with the theme of analysis of culture and trying to figure out historically how we got to where we are today, um, I also sort of shape the book around a literary theme, more or less. And it's sort of written as a semi-popular piece of work. And so I was trying to make it readable, accessible in whatever way I could. And I sort of doing a few things in regards to evangelization, giving a few talks here and there, I sort of came up with this notion of, well, I can, in some say, shape my ideas around Tolkien's Middle Earth, Lord of the Rings universe that he created. And it is this cosmic sort of story of good and evil, and the triumph over evil, albeit in very painful circumstances. And in some sense, that to me is an analogy for the condition of faith today. You could say we're not sort of arrayed in bright armor like the soldiers of Gondor, for example. That age has passed with all of its ambiguities. Certainly, that would be a word that perhaps sums up Christian history in some sense historically. But whatever is the case, we don't have that anymore. So we're more like these two hobbits who are trudging one foot after another on their way to Mordor. And of course, they just assume that they're going to die there because they're walking into Sauron's evil empire, if you will, the logic of the machine, force, violence. In a sense, that's another cultural similarity in regards to our age as well. So here we have these two hobbits with nothing but their own two legs, but more importantly, with faith. And they know they have a mission and they are prepared to sacrifice their life for it. So in some sense, that's an analogy for me that sums up our condition today. And in terms of this faith that, as the gospel puts it, can move mountains. In this case, they were trying to drop a ring into a fiery volcano, but I think the image in some sense works. But this could be us. And for me, being a hobbit represents what is sort of the fundamental dimension of the evangelical vocation that we're all called to preach the gospel, the good news. And in some sense, we preach that first and foremost when that's become something internalized in me, such that now I become a radiant icon of this truth that I profess. And it's only if I have that faith, that belief, that conviction, that I can really then be a light for the world, and that perhaps I can be like Sam and Frodo on their way to Mordor, not lose faith, not give in to despair. And also within that, I was sort of taken by the notion of the fellowship of the ring, that, certainly at least at the beginning, they're not in this alone. They have this fellowship. They have a kind of culture which holds them up and guides them. And that, of course, is fundamental to Christian identity as well. And of course, we don't really have that in many respects. We have glimpses of it from time to time, but the struggle for living in community and being supported in our faith, that's part of our historical experience as well. So I try to develop that in the book as sort of the ground level basis of, well, if you want to be a good evangelist, well, you yourself have to confront yourself, own your belief, embrace your belief, and more importantly, integrate that belief into your own life before you can expect to make it credible to the world. So something like Jordan Peterson talks about, you got to clean your own room before you can go out and change the world. So evangelization is not sort of activism. It's not even the disembodied word simply in the form of an intellectual argument. It's simply, in some sense, the slog of daily life, trying to live in fidelity to your own baptism.
You were talking about personal responsibility before Jordan Peterson made it cool.
Yes. Well, it's nice to hear that. I mean, I'm certainly not as famous as maybe after this podcast.
I'm sorry, but we're not that big.
Oh, you are now.
But that's a beautiful picture to paint of where of the disposition, the place that we need to be ourselves, that we ourselves need to be at before we can even consider going out. And then but also it makes me think that in itself is a journey as well. It's not just the going out.
Indeed. And in some sense, it's harder in regards to faith for ourselves, and harder because, well, I mean, it is always hard, no matter what historical age we've lived in, and challenge of belief and our hard-heartedness and our concupiscence and all the rest of it. I mean, we see that drama played out in the scriptural text very vividly. So nothing's changed in that regard, but certainly there are factors today that have, in fundamental ways, and this is again getting into the thesis of the book, in fundamental ways changed the very fabric of human experience in a way that former ages didn't have. So I talk a bit about technology in the book, this selfie stick. And technology has literally changed our experience of reality, such that claims of faith may no longer appear as they once did. We can now create a technological world where, unless you stop and think about it, well, all your needs are met in some way, and this is, in some sense, virtual reality is better than reality itself. And so there's any number of imaginative ways in which we can escape the specter of our own mortality and finitude and suffering. But of course, ultimately, none of it actually works. And so we do find we're in greater despair, perhaps, than we've ever been before, at least here in the West. And so I really did want to try to dial in on some of those cultural factors which make belief for ourselves a real existential challenge.
Brilliant. It kind of flows on to a next question that sort of sits on my mind, which is, you do actually talk about the virtual sort of so-called virtual evangelization.
Yes.
And in the sort of present COVID world that we've got, in particular in the last couple of years, where sort of everything is on Zoom. Like, if you had have invested in stock in Zoom before 2020, I mean, you'd have just been you've been rolling in it, So Uh, the we're sort of at a point where masses and talks and sort of all this sort of stuff is starting to come online, and in some ways I can see that it's been helpful during a period where people were unable to get out. Like I get that it has a
Yes.
helpful dimension. I can't help but feeling though as well that there is a dangerous side to this as well. I'm just wondering if we could get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good instinct. I think what we've seen is just how many things we can do online. And I mean, personally, I'm not a fan of it. I try to avoid it whenever I can, except of course for this podcast here.
Thank you for making the
But
exception.
Thanks.
certainly the temptation is there, and the temptation is really, in some sense, that I can escape embodied existence
Mm.
and all of its trials and all of its limitations. Um, and it's just easier, perhaps, to stay in your basement and simply stream a live mass or talk to your friends online. Or, hey, I don't even have to talk to my friends. Maybe I can just play video games or go into my virtual reality, and it's more exciting and glamorous there. And I'm a nerd in real life, but I can be a hero here in this virtual world. So there are temptations in terms of supercharging, what is our natural aversion to confronting ourself, let's say. And if you have a problem with community, and you're not human in some sense if you don't have a problem with community, it's not easy living with other people. And so there are temptations in that regards in terms of a fundamentally sort of disembodied way of living. Now that's problematic from the point of view of who we are as body soul composites. I mean, there is this bodily dimension, and it is in and through the body that the spiritual is experienced. I mean, JP2 talked about the body as a primordial sacrament. It's the site of the real, where you see the fullness of truth. The essence of Christian life, again, going back to baptism, is indeed this bodily immersion, this contact, this feeling, sensing, touching contact, not just with God in the sacrament, think of the sacrament of the Eucharist, but also with our fellow man as well. So the church is fundamentally a reality of communion, one body in Christ, this communion of sharing in this relationship with God, in his church, and with other people. So as soon as you start to undermine that, in some sense, you start to undermine what it means to be human. And unfortunately, with something like the pandemic, well, the logic might go, well, in the name of safety, I need to stay away from going to mass because there's risk there. There's risk of illness. And so in some sense now it's, well, there are a lot of other things that I've been doing that aren't particularly safe as well. So I should stop doing those as well. And before I know it, I'm sort of living paralyzed in fear when it comes to actually living an embodied human existence. And so digital technology, in some sense, holds this specter of a disembodied virtual existence as, in some sense, the new ultimate good that we should be pursuing. Talk about transhumanism. The goal is a kind of disembodied spirit reality that, hey, we could actually maybe live forever in some perverse way. We can talk about the metaverse, Mark Zuckerberg's new vision for reality. Virtual headsets. I mean, we are perfecting these technologies in remarkably freaky ways. And really, I mean, the sky is literally the limit in terms of what we can do. You look at what we've done in the last 100 years technologically, and if even a fraction of that pace continues for the next 100 years, I mean, who knows where we'll be there. But if it's true that we're bodies and that's the ground level in regards to who we are existentially in terms of our ontological constitution, in terms of faith, then it is a problem in terms of what virtual technology can represent.
At a gut level, that makes so much intuitive sense. Just thinking about the pandemic and even the people that I spoke to, the fatigue that people felt from all of
that's an
the
interesting
Zoom
phenomenon.
calls, and even though they were supposedly connecting with other people, the exhaustion that came from that, and people still feeling so dissatisfied. I think at a gut level, we got it.
It's not like just sitting around in a room with someone, in a social sense. I mean, there is this real reality in terms of the bodily presence, that whole phenomenon. So you take that out of the picture and we try and live like brains in a vat or as human bobbleheads. I mean, it just doesn't really cut it ultimately.
Yeah. No, for sure.
And I mean, if I could just say one more thing, because I can't stop talking. But of course, the problem is in terms of how we deal with this is, I have to have one of these
Right.
if I want to function in the so-called real world. And so if I am sort of in some sense constrained by the world itself that we've set up, I mean, how can I actually detach myself from it? I mean, in some sense, I can't. A lot of these things have become instruments that are necessary in terms of working a 9 to 5 job. And so we can't be sort of absolutely like Luddites in relation to it, but there is a sense in which we need to also cultivate, real bodily sacramental existence as the foundation and the basis of the real for my own life, so that I can, in some sense, use these technologies when I have to without them consuming my identity in my life.
Yeah. I think of one of my parishioners here in Narandra is housebound, and and clever with a computer despite her age, and so I come and give her Holy Communion once a
Mm-hmm.
once a week, but she also watches Mass online. That's something that she religiously does. Is that she'll watch a Mass online, and the following day I come and give her Holy Communion. I think the moment at which she watches Mass online is probably if I can use the word, a moment of grace for her. But I think the
Sure.
more profound moment of grace is when Father comes with Holy Communion. It's an online sacramental world is kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? I mean, those
That's
two things
right.
just
That's
don't go
right.
together. Online and sacramental. The whole point of sacramental is that there's a bodily thing here. And while I think
Mm.
that the online realm can actually be an occasion of grace, I mean, even from the perspective of evangelization, Ascension Presents, the various stuff that's particularly come out of the States, which is some pretty awesome
Yeah.
stuff,
Yeah.
Awesome stuff.
can be real occasions of grace, but nothing quite supplies for the person to person contact, and nothing
Correct. I
supplies
mean,
for the sacramental reality. Yeah.
yeah, you need that as your sort of base level reality. And the problem, of course, is that in many cases we don't have that in any real functional and non-dysfunctional kind of way. So, I mean, I think ultimately there's been a lot of stuff good in terms of online evangelization, this podcast, for example. And that's great. But the problem is when that, in some sense, there's a risk that that becomes that it subtly changes our understanding of what faith is, who God is, to a kind of textual, digital thing, to a kind of Gnostic reality that consists of the right information, orthodoxy. And as long as I have the right information at my fingertips, I can spew out this doctrine and this creed and all the rest of it, then that makes me somehow a good Christian. So it's like, okay, we're feeding the life of the mind here, and that's good. But are we also feeding the body? Are we actually recognizing this knowledge as ultimately serving the integration of the person, serving an understanding of faith where it's not just about ideas, but it's about this new sacramental relation to God? It's seeing God face to face. It is being healed in myself so that I can be in communion with others. So the problem is not per se the technology in many cases, but the problem is that on the ground, we have deep, deep problems when it comes to the embodying of faith. And until you fix that, in some sense, you can throw as much information as you want at it. But it's like your parishioner there, Father. I mean, it's probably she's grateful for the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, yes, but it's probably also really good for her to have that mediated by you, her pastor, to see you in the flesh.
Yeah.
And so that's all part of this,
Yeah.
communion being of
Absolutely.
the essence of Christian life that we risk if we sort of say, well, as long as we have the right doctrines and as long as we have all these good websites and programs and so on, then, well, what more do we really need?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Right.
maybe that sort of ends up precluding that, no, this knowledge ultimately serves the embodied reality itself. But those are just some of the thoughts that in some sense come through in the book as well.
Absolutely. One last question before we get to our last question, which is a ridiculous sentence now that I've said it out loud. In the very first pages of your book, you make a point that living faith does not mean living in a ghetto.
Yes.
And you say it takes the center of the church to the heart of the world. Can you speak to that for us for a bit?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things I've just been saying, one particular interpretation of it would be to say, well, technology, the world, secularism, that's all bad. And so what we should do is retreat to our cave and, attempt to insulate ourselves from the world. You've probably heard of the Benedict option. It's
Sure.
sort of been popularized recently. Now, what I've just said doesn't have to be the Benedict option per se, but there is a sort of caricature that if we want to survive, we have to sort of distance ourselves from the world in some fundamental way. Now, that's not what I'm arguing in the book, although I do say in some sense we do need to distance ourselves, not absolutely, but as open our eyes to the challenges of the world and the way that things within the world undermine our faith, but from that move towards self-consciously trying to cultivate a baptismal identity, trying to come back into content with that living faith that in the span of about 4 centuries after Christ had ended up taking over the world at that time. I mean, a remarkable transformation. So how do we enter into that kind of encounter and relationship with faith once again? One of the things that I do with my my juniors here at the college, Christendom College, teaching them about evangelization and apologetics, is we go back to the experience of the early church and we try to figure out, well, what was it that made Christian belief so attractive in the beginning to these Roman people at this time. One historian has sort of talked about the way that Christians kept their identity intact. He uses the word belief, belonging, and behavior. And these were very much in a kind of tight matrix in regards to the early Christians' identity. And so they guarded things like worship very carefully. Only believers, the initiated, were allowed in to even see what was going on at the celebration of the Eucharist. Belief was very important in terms of vetting catechumens. Are you actually converting for the right reasons, as it were? And then, of course, there's also this notion that, well, this is a total way of life. Early Christians simply called Christianity the way. And so it's not like you can do this or that act and call yourself a Christian. So integrating belief, faith, and behavior was also very important, providing a total sort of worldview. Now, none of this means, however, that the Christians were simply isolating themselves from the world at the time. Yes, they were concerned about their identities, their community, their practices, but it was precisely a robust identity cultivated there that then allowed them to go out. And they engaged the world. Acts of love, caritas, caring for the poor, caring for abandoned babies. This is all very typical of ancient Roman society. And they were doing things that no one else had ever thought to do. And they were doing things out of love as an extension of this profound identity, the relationship with Christ that was cultivated in the church, not just at the level of the mind, but also embodied in belonging and behavior. So in some sense, that's what's needed. How you do that practically is the big question. But again, Christianity is not just about an idea. It's not just about an abstraction, but it very much is a total lived, organic, and ultimately social reality as well.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to hear. I think um, it can always be a bit of a temptation to think, well, if I'm going to preserve something, it means becoming insular. And
Yes.
in fact, I think the preservation of a Christian identity actually demands, like just what you've been saying, really, it demands mission. It demands that I
Yes,
go
absolutely.
out. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Yeah. Yeah.
So we have one final question, which we like to ask all of our guests that come on the Living Fullness podcast. So we'd love
Okay.
to hear what your thoughts are. What do you think it takes to live life to the full?
Life to the full. Well, I think I've softened you up a little bit in terms of what my answer might be. Um, Obviously, we're talking about the primacy of faith. We're created in God's image, the incarnation, the hypostatic union, these amazing things that God gives us by way of revealing himself to us. I mean, that is life and life to the full, as Christ himself spoke of it. So that's fundamental. And again, as I've been saying, that has to become a living reality in your life if it's actually going to have an effect. We can't sustain that purely as an intellectual abstraction. So I tend to be a very existential kind of a guy. You can ask my students about that. In some sense, we do really need to confront the way that faith challenges us. We can't just be satisfied if we have the correct belief. How do we live? What is the condition of my heart, first and foremost? And of course, I raise these questions knowing full well the condition of my own heart. So, this stubbornness and hard-heartedness, which belongs to the fallen condition. So life to the full very much just means deeper and deeper immersion into the mystery of the incarnation, death, passion, resurrection of Christ, which is given to us as an event, as an encounter in the baptismal font. And so, I mean, obviously you can say a lot more about what constitutes a full life, but as a theologian, that would be the first thing that comes to mind.
That's awesome.
Love it.
Conor, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing a little bit of your hope for Christianity, really, that it becomes we become an evangelizing people. So we move now to a quick lightning round, and Stina, you kick off for us.
Okay, sure. First question. Just the first thing that comes to mind, Connor.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, okay, here we go. No pressure.
First question is tea or coffee?
Oh, coffee. I almost said tea. Coffee. It's coffee. I have one tea a day, but coffee keeps me going until the evening when I have a tea.
I already knew the answer to that question.
I think
Scaring myself.
Padre and I have this competition going at the moment of how many guests can we get to say tea for me. And I think he's teeing up the guests.
Almost happened.
He's teeing up the guests right now.
And what's a hobby you enjoy?
Golf.
Oh, okay, cool.
I don't play enough of it,
but it's nice.
Favorite band or composer?
You want to know the first thing that came to mind? Nirvana.
Yeah,
nice. My favorite,
yeah.
That's the first thing that came to mind.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But I am more of a lover of classical music.
Sure.
But every now and again, when I'm feeling existential, I reconnect with some of the music.
That's fantastic. The other thing is that there's now a whole group of young people Googling Nirvana, which is just wonderful.
Yeah, it's exactly. Well, it's a lot better than the stuff young people listen to today.
What's one thing that people misunderstand about you?
Oh boy, that's a good question. That's sort of tapping into my insecurities and anxieties.
Sorry about that.
I have no idea. What they don't know about me, most people don't know what I look like without a beard, actually. So
true.
So long now,
Yep. Okay.
I can't think of anything more profound.
I don't think I've ever seen you without a beard either. So that's.
All right, there you go. What does he look like underneath?
It's a mystery. What is the first memory that comes to mind when I say Australia?
Kangaroos.
Yeah.
but it's more than that. That's just a stereotype. But, yeah.
But a memory. Is there a memory that comes to mind?
A memory, yeah. That's a good question. I don't like snakes, and I have memories of seeing my first poisonous snake in the wild in Australia. That's also stereotypical, but I remember that. I do remember that. But probably memories, and just in terms of I had four of my kids, 3 of my kids were born there. So we've got little Aussie Canadians. So that's certainly memories that stick out to me in terms of, just being Australian, and they'll of course now have a chance to go back whenever they want with no dramas, if our world ever does return to some semblance of normalcy. But no, that's probably what I would say there.
Cool. Okay, and finally, you're on a desert island. You can have 3 things. What are they?
Do I have to say the Bible, or is that just too cliche?
That's just a cliche. You can say what you want.
3 things. Well, I would probably need a book or 2. I'll bring Balthazar's "Love Alone Is Credible" as a book. 3 things. Well, I'll probably want my wife there. I'll bring my wife there. I don't know if you're allowed to say that, but the 3rd thing, well, water, just to keep me alive.
Nice. Balthazar, your wife, and water.
Water.
I like it.
Yeah. All right.
Alrighty. Thank you once again for being with us, Dr. Conor
My
Sweeney.
pleasure.
You can certainly buy
We'll link a
Dr.
copy of
Connor's
the
book, Abiding
Yep.
the Long Defeat, and you can purchase that through Amazon or any of the sort of normal channels that you purchase books from. You can pick that up, and it's a really good read, so I suggest you do so. That was very forthright. I suggest you do so, wasn't it? That was, yeah. but I really do.
encourage.
I encourage.
As your pastor. Right?
That's right. Conor, once again, thank you for your presence and your insight.
For those of you who aren't already members of our Patreon community, I encourage you to jump over there and become a Patreon, because we're going to continue the conversation with Dr. Conor today about the role of families in evangelisation. So if you'd like to jump over and sign up to one of the higher tiers, you'll have access to that conversation. So until next time, more of our love and prayers.
God bless. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Living Fullness. We hope that in this episode there was something useful or helpful, or something that blessed your life. If that is the case, would you please consider sharing this podcast with someone? Perhaps it will bless their lives too.
Please also subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. That will also help others to find the podcast too. And join us over on our social media, Living Fullness on Instagram and Virtue Ministry on Facebook.